is your? I thought I saw your car out there. Gordon.
Oh, sorry. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Committee on Ordinance for Monday, September 21st, 2015. I'm the chairwoman, Rebecca Lisi. From my left, we also have Ward 7 City Councilor Gordon Alexander, and then to my right, Ward 5 City Councilor Linda Vacan, and Councilor at Large Jennifer Shatnoff. The first item on our agenda is the acceptance of the previous meeting minutes. They were emailed to us. Does anyone have any amendments to make?
I don't. I'll make a motion to approve, accept and approve.
Motion has been made to accept and approve the previous meeting minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
So moved. And then item number 2 on our agenda this evening is an order filed by Councilor Vacan that our ordinances be reviewed to revise language to prevent panhandling at gateways to our city and other locations. This activity does not promote a business-friendly environment. Consider adding language that panhandlers be required to obtain a permit from the municipal police department that is a crime to panhandle in commercial areas as well, within 50 feet of any bank or automated teller machine, and that is considered a crime for panhandlers to make false or untrue statements or to disguise themselves, to solicit money and to use money obtained for a claim of specific purpose, e.g. food, to be spent on anything else.
Motion to take up item 2. Second.
Motion has been made and seconded to take up item number 2. All in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Under discussion, Counselor Bacon.
Thank you. I filed this order because I had gotten some input from some of our officers that they have little to work with in trying to address this issue when getting complaints. And also from a report from somebody that I work with, that when he was assisting elders on a van to go to a store, one of the elders was approached by somebody soliciting money right in the parking lot of a commercial center. And this person happens to be a retired police officer, and so shared with me that our police department, there was, I think, an officer in the area who was very responsive and helpful, but I think it's just bringing to mind the increase in aggressiveness of some of the people that are carrying out this activity. Other reports that I have had are that people, specifically on Hampden and Northampton Street, and this was observed within the last 2 months, are actually having shifts of panhandling. And the one person who was there for a certain period of time coordinated with the next person coming to the spot and handed off their sign. So it appears that some of this activity is quite organized and more along the lines of sort of a offline business, under the radar money collection activity than simply a homeless person who is either going through town or just came to town and is seeking some money to have a meal because they're hungry. So there are a variety of pieces of information that came to my attention that led me to file this order. Now, in trying to do some research, and I haven't had time to do really deep research, I know there is a balance that has to be struck between sort of the freedom of speech issues versus the safety issues versus what is commercial activity. And so I think our job will be a little bit harder than it might look if you're just saying, well, just say they can't stand here and just say you can't be there. I think it is a little more complicated than that. However, I did also have an opportunity to speak to a retired police officer from South Hadley, and they do not have a panhandling issue in South Hadley. And that's interesting to note. They have a couple of things, and I don't have the exact language, but I hope maybe before the next time we take this up, we can get it. They have some sort of a rule on the books that people cannot solicit or be undertaking this type of activity where it will hinder and interfere with the flow of traffic. So for example, if there's traffic going into the mall or a shopping plaza and the activity is causing people to slow down, to keep people behind them from being able to get through the light or proceed on the public way, that is not allowed. And this officer let me know that they would enforce that aspect of their laws in the town, and that had some.
I'm sorry, in South Hadley?
Yes.
Okay.
The other rule that they have on the books is that any person or group must register with the town prior to any solicitation in the city. And so I think particularly if there's organized and repeated solicitation of money going on by people that become recognized in spaces at times or making a circuit from space to space, that could be correctly called solicitation, and then there could be some rules set where these people would have to register that they're doing an activity for a purpose. I mean, we have people have to register and file a permit fee for a tag sale, you know? So I think if we require people to do that on their own private property, certainly we're not going too far in considering something like this. So those are just a few things that I was able to find out before tonight. And maybe Kara has some other information for us too. Thank you.
Thanks. So,
Can I make a motion to suspend and have Kara actually join us inside the bar tonight?
Second.
Because I think we need her all night. And there's room, yes.
While she's coming in, can I just touch upon the
Yeah.
safety issue? Because I was talking to a few police officers the last week in my restaurant, because I knew this was coming up. And they say it's not a problem, you know, a lot of them stand on the side of the road, but lately they've been becoming very abrasive, and they've been actually going into traffic, and if they see a car where it's a single young girl or a woman with kids, like, they'll just go up and stare right into the window
Really?
and intimidate them into giving them something. So it's just, you know, it has become a safety issue, and there's nothing they can do. I mean, they can stretch it and say disorderly conduct and bring them into court, but it gets thrown out in court. I mean, it doesn't hold once it gets to court. But they have said that it's, you know, people are becoming fearful.
so, I think we have something on the books that says you can't do something that's like harassing in terms of,
We never adopted that. The issue has come up and come before the council. It looks like the first time was back in 2008, and that is what was proposed was an ordinance based in large part on other communities to prohibit aggressive panhandling or public solicitation, but that was never adopted. And then it did come up again a couple years ago, more recently, 2013, after the city of Worcester adopted, again, a similar ordinance and actually started enforcing it. But I can tell you, since that time, the city of Worcester has been sued by the ACLU, and the case has gone all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It recently, very recently, was actually sent back down to the lower federal courts to reconsider in light of another recent Supreme Court decision on signage. And so I spoke with the Worcester City Solicitor today, and they're in the process of coming up with a schedule for briefs for summary judgment motions. It's likely that case could go again all the way back to the United States Supreme Court, depending on what happens. The city of Lowell, likewise, has been sued by the ACLU, and it's the same law firm that's handling the plaintiff's case for a similar panhandling ordinance, and that case is only still in federal district court. There also was recently, again, from the First Circuit, which is our circuit of federal court, the court struck down an ordinance in the city of Portland that prohibited anybody from standing or staying, I forget the words, on a traffic median. And while that's basically all the ordinance said, it was targeted at panhandling and was struck down by the court. There's a couple other cases. The recent Supreme Court decision, it's called Reed versus Gilbert, regarding signage, has kind of thrown this area of the law in regards to free speech, signage, apparently panhandling, as I learned today, kind of up in the air as far as what the law truly is. I mean, my advice honestly would be to wait and see what happens with the Worcester and the Lowell cases before tackling any kind of ordinance. I think it's pretty, well, two parts. That would be my advice. And then in the meantime, I think what the case law also makes clear is that you need a solid record to support adopting an ordinance like this. The city of Lowell, in the decision, documented, you know, the number of complaints that the police have had, the type of complaints that they've had. Likewise, the city of Worcester had done the same thing and had gone even further and documented outreach to the people who are panhandling, to see if there were services that could help them or things like that. And that's kind of what the courts have looked at. The Worcester City Solicitor's advice was to do that, to have documented outreach, to see what the underlying issues are, as well as to simply prohibit any kind of solicitation so that there's no exceptions for anything. But, I think where the state of the law is quite unsettled, it would not be advisable to adopt an ordinance at this time. But at the same time, eventually the Worcester ordinance could be upheld. It was upheld originally and then reversed by the Supreme Court. So that could go in tandem with developing the evidence that would ultimately support the fact that there is a panhandling problem in the city.
Questions? Counselor Bacon.
Thanks. So in Worcester, are you saying that they prohibited the activity?
Yes, and actually the Worcester ordinance is extremely similar to what we had originally looked at. It was prohibiting soliciting, and they set up a variety of criteria, again, focusing on aggressive soliciting, and they, in large part, delineated where, for people waiting in line for a bus or waiting in line for a ticket within so many feet of an ATM machine, within so many feet of, similar, an ATM, outdoor seating areas, check cashing, transportation facility, groups of people, and then approaching people after dark. It was very similar criteria to what we had originally looked at in drafting an ordinance. And the Lowell ordinance was a little different. It targeted verbal solicitations in some areas of the city. It outlawed all types of solicitations in other areas. It made a distinction between the downtown historic area and other areas of the city.
So if I take your point, we're talking about ordinances where an activity was outright prohibited. Mm-hmm. So my order isn't really suggesting the prohibition of an activity, which may or may not be found to be constitutionally allowable. But certainly we know that for somebody to be aggressively intimidating somebody is not legal. And certainly we know that if people can organize and in essence conduct a business collecting money for regular hours throughout a day, that is a regulated type of activity under our current laws.
What the cases are looking at is the free speech aspect, and what the ordinance has to be is content neutral. And so that's what this whole analysis falls under. And the court found in the Portland case where it said you can't stand or stay on a median, they struck that down. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward. It also has to be, they found it was too broad, and it didn't look at which particular medians might not be safe, or the registration part of it might be something that's different. I would have to do further research into that. I will say the parts of the order that address a person making false or untrue statements or using money for something other than what they claim would absolutely be unconstitutional, because it's targeting the content of what they're saying. Okay. So, I mean, you can stand there and say, I'm going to give money to whatever. That is the speech aspect of it, okay, and could not.
Well, those I put in as examples of what some other places had done.
Yeah.
Not to say we should necessarily do it, but to put it out there to say, is this something we could do? Is it something we should do? Would it be practical in the implementation of it? Because we all know we have a lot of laws on the books that never get enforced, and half the people don't even know they're on the books. And so I also thought it would give us an opportunity, if we do have things on the books where the officers could reduce the safety concerns that people are having, could reduce the interference with people to move on a public way, which is their right as a citizen. I mean, somebody's freedom of speech does not trump my ability to move freely in the public square. So they don't get to have their freedom and I don't get to have mine. You know, and so this is the balance I'm trying to strike. And if town of South Hadley can require people to register, to solicit, and they can have an ordinance on the books that doesn't allow an activity that hinders or interferes with the flow of traffic, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. It doesn't matter if they're panhandling, you're standing there with your political sign, it doesn't really matter what you're doing if you're interfering with the traffic.
Right. I mean, well, so I'll certainly look at the South Hadley, the registration. I mean, we do have some old ordinances about like peddlers and hawkers, and they're called solicitors.
They're really old-fashioned.
in those, so they
Yeah,
might just be the same.
Yeah.
And the part about the traffic, ultimately, the Worcester ordinance against panhandling is a good ordinance, the way it addresses the concerns you want it to address. And I don't think the reason why they sent it, although it's the Supreme Court, the case that they cited was more in regards to signage. I don't necessarily think it has an impact, but the court really shifted the way that they look at speech and signage, and so this is not the only case. There's other circuits that are doing the same thing. So I guess it's a matter of not necessarily jumping into this foray right now when there is going to be some settled law in a relatively soon time that's going to address, what you can and can't do. Because ultimately, if the Worcester ordinance is upheld, I think that would be an example of what we would want to do. And if we're looking to kind of parse these, I still think we're opening ourselves up to potential lawsuits.
Well, from a certain point of view, every single action we take potentially opens us up to a lawsuit.
Hear ye.
No, I don't disagree, but I think here it's pretty.
Doing
it's
anything opens us up to a
pretty
potential
clear.
lawsuit.
I mean, again, going back to the Portland decision, the idea of the medians was all in regards to public safety.
Right.
And frankly, the court didn't buy it, and they looked at, so if we were to go down that route,
Yeah.
what we would need to do to have evidence to support why we need this is documented evidence of why this is presenting a safety hazard. The court looked, in the Portland case, they looked at police records of signs that had been knocked down in traffic islands, of whether there were incidents of pedestrians being hit. Those are all the types of factors. We would need a record to support the fact that people are panhandling in a way that is interfering with traffic, and that would have to be documented by the police or the DPW in order to support the ordinance.
Can I just ask one more question?
Sure, and then Councilor Alexander's in queue.
When I was driving down here for the meeting tonight, there was a panhandler standing in the road on the ramp from 391. So does that come under the jurisdiction of the state because it's 391, or the city because it's the ramp?
The ramp is probably, of who owns that property, but, if somebody's there loitering, potentially, the police, I would think, would be the enforcing authority.
Well, the person was standing there panhandling, but the person was in the road, not on the grass, in the road part of the way where a car would go by. And my thing is, I just really believe we should do something before, some poor driver hits a panhandler who's in the road, and it's the driver's fault because they hit somebody in the road who shouldn't have ever have been there, because we haven't
Maybe that's the strategic.
found a way to enforce the safety aspect. And, I don't want to be sitting here talking about this after some elderly person is accosted by an aggressive panhandler because, we couldn't do anything because we were afraid we might get sued, while the person, if the employee hadn't been with that woman that day, who knows how much money the person would have gotten from her. You know, these people have cognitive impairments. They certainly have physical impairments at a frail elderly age. And we have a high percentage of elders here in Holyoke, and they need to go to the plazas, and they need to use the buses and be out in the public square and at the mall. So I hear you, but do you have any idea of when you think this will be settled? I mean, is it a year?
I mean, the Worcester case, well, they're working on briefing now, you know, from what their attorney indicated, you know, there could be further appeals, so, and that's why I'm not saying to not do anything. I think you would, in the meantime, I mean, obviously, this is a conversation with the police, and I can't stress enough how much you need that evidence to support that, because, well, I mean, I guess if, you know, if ultimately these ordinances are struck down, you wouldn't be able to do anything anyways, and hopefully the courts will offer some guidance, but in the meantime, you know, even if these ordinances are upheld, that doesn't mean it couldn't still be challenged, and so again, we need the evidence to support the fact, you know, of why this is truly a problem and needs to be addressed, because the test is that it needs to be tailored to fit the problem, and so you have to have evidence of what that problem is. If the evidence is that at some intersections this is a problem, and it turns out these are commercial zones, then you know, maybe you look at not you know, enacting an ordinance for parts or by zone or something like that, but we have to actually have some data to support what we want, because an overbroad ordinance that just says at any intersection is probably not going to be upheld based on the current state of what the courts are doing. And this is all really, I'm talking about these decisions are coming out in the past month. It's that recent, and it's changing that quickly.
But would there be a burden of proof that you would have to put forth to require people to register with the city as to who they are when they're carrying out a scheduled and repeated activity in the city?
And that is somewhat of a different issue. Again, it's going to have to be content neutral, where anybody who's asking for any kind of money is going, so,
Yeah.
including political candidates, charities, anybody would have to register with the police. That's a little bit of a different aspect, I guess, that we would have to look into.
And I do want to mention that the police chief was invited to tonight's meeting. I don't know if he was able
I
to
spoke with
respond.
him, he said he hadn't received any notice.
Oh, okay,
I
thank
spoke
you.
with him this afternoon, so, and we didn't really discuss substantively all that much. He said he hadn't received any notice of the meeting and wasn't going to be here, so I do think it would be useful to get his take on it.
Well, or anybody that he might
Send in
choose
his
to
place.
Sure.
have participate, just to get their perspective and what they might find helpful. But the officers are saying they need something to work with in order for the activity and the behavior to stop. And if we have residents telling us they feel threatened, and we have residents observing essentially change of shifts of this activity, and we know that they are collecting money of some unknown amount, then it seems that it falls into sort of a regularly occurring activity. I mean, we're ticketing people if they don't put the right trash in the right trash container. And yet, it seems like we can't do anything about an activity that our residents are saying is troublesome to them.
And another option would be for that, I'm not saying you can't necessarily do it, I'm saying again, you know, anecdotal evidence, then perhaps a public hearing. I mean, that was part of some of the other, you know, evidence that was developed. You know, if you're looking to ultimately defend an ordinance, and I'm happy to send the cases, you know, there's depositions, there's business owners testifying, chambers of commerce testifying about the impact on business. There's really a true record developed that this is a problem and needs to be addressed, because I'm sure in these communities too, they recognize the issues that this could potentially end up in litigation, and that's what you need to ultimately support it. So I think that those are things that could start happening towards developing some kind of an ordinance. And in the meantime, while we wait for these court decisions to hopefully clarify, what we ultimately can and can't do.
So you don't see any avenue for us to take to do anything to diminish this increasingly persistent and problem that people are getting upset about and reporting to us? There must be some path we could take.
Well, I think I've outlined it. I mean, again, to develop what this problem is, where the areas in the city are, what the true numbers are of police complaints.
But maybe the people, so what we are then compelled to do is go back to the people that are saying, this happened to me. Well, you have to call the police and document it in order for us to be able to do anything. Even the idea of setting up the registration issue. I mean, I know a private property owner can let anybody on their property to solicit if they want. Like up at the mall, they let the Salvation Army people come on. That's their private property. They can say, yep, you can do whatever you want. It's their discretion. But we're talking in the public.
The registration, I said, I'll look into see what South Hadley has and
All
what
right.
that looks like.
But I mean,
You could adopt the ordinance that Worcester has, and, I'm not gonna guarantee anything, but I would say it would be very likely that as soon as the police attempt to enforce it, it would be a lawsuit. It's pretty clear that ACLU is pursuing these types of ordinances, and it would be very difficult to then go and defend that without the kind of documentation to support it. So that's why that needs to be developed before any type of broad ordinance is adopted.
And I hear you on the prohibition aspect.
But it's not, I mean,
Or the
it's all
restrictive aspect.
ties in together, yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's somebody that's a panhandler, and one of the cases, I think it was either Lowell or Worcester, the plaintiffs are school committee members who were alleging the same ordinance was interfering with their political speech and campaigning. And so it's not just
That's right.
Panhandling.
The sign holding up by the Yankee Peddler.
that's that would be part of it. That's,
So,
I appreciate that you will look into what South Hadley is doing, and I mean, to me, it wouldn't be too onerous if organized groups had to go and register as a group soliciting money in the city. If you needed a general thing that anybody doing that activity has to do it, well then, so be it. Other than private people who say, you can stand and panhandle in my driveway. I mean, if it's your private property, I guess Jen can let them stand in her driveway. If she feels like, it's a benefit. But, so that would be great if we can do something. I just think even if we had the registration, where people had to come in and say, this is who I am, this is where I live or don't live, because if the people are indeed homeless, we have many services, outreach, shelters, organizations that address that. I don't think it is the average citizen's requirement to have to find out why the person that is harassing them, panhandling, is doing it. And so I just think that's an unfair burden on the other person trying to use the public way. So that would be great if we could at least do something while we're waiting for the other lawsuits to work their way through. Although I sort of hate to have that be a reason to do nothing. Maybe some of the committee members will come up with some new idea in between the things that seem to be prohibited and nothing.
well, I want to point out that I received an email from a constituent in Ward 3 who is concerned about the same issue, and found a resource online from the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing through the University at Albany. And they talk about, I really haven't given this a good look. Ryan just printed it out here for tonight's meeting. But what I did notice is that they have a summary of responses, and they go through this in more detail throughout the packet, but it says that there are several enforcement responses, and then how it works best if, and considerations. And they do outline the solicitation permit tract, which is number 6. It would be on the top of page 15. So requiring panhandlers to obtain solicitation permits, how it works is it discourages panhandling through the procedural requirements that many panhandlers are unlikely to follow, allows for easier enforcement, no witnesses are required, works best if police officers are informed of the permit requirement and consistently enforce it, and the considerations may be viewed as unfair by the public. Little is known about how effective this approach is. So it'd be interesting to, actually look at the language that South Hadley is using. I can't recall, but I thought that we were modeling our aggressive panhandling ordinance on Northampton's adoption of something similar. Do you know if they have something on the books currently, or if they actually had it struck down or deleted because of these pending lawsuits?
I think, I mean, and really, places can have these on the books, and obviously, in all these cases, it's been, well, in Lowell, it actually wasn't enforced. They were sued based on amendments to it. In Worcester, it was enforced. People were arrested. Those are the people that sued. And Northampton does have an ordinance, and we had looked at that. I mean, the original draft we had considered was extremely similar to the Worcester one. And I think Springfield has a similar one as well, because keeping in mind that was several years ago, and looking at what the laws were and what it looked like you could do. I would just note too that this is from 2002, so any of the case law that's referred to is now 13 years out of date, and are probably some of the cases that have been affected by these other ones.
And then I think, it's really interesting to see that there are, public education and situational responses. I think if we had a more robust, adopt an island, situation, maybe it's not like, adopt an island, or if the city had more robust plantings going on.
Including its panhandler?
Well, you wouldn't have space for panhandlers to stand and collect money if there was.
Stand in the
Yeah,
garden.
no, that's probably.
Well, I mean, I actually took a picture of this because the plantings on UMass campus are really, really nice. They're really uniform. They really left an impression on me. And I was driving up and down Route 5, between daycare drop-offs and then heading out to school. And I was some of these medians on Route 5 that are adopted on islands were totally overgrown with weeds. So it was wouldn't it be nice if we could do something that was more uniform? And if they were more substantial and took up more space, I think you would have less opportunity for people to stand in the road or median in that case, because you would have a big gigantic planter with plants in it, and not just a whiskey barrel, but really they were really big, substantial. I don't know what planters is the best way that I could describe them. So I think, it's worth this group taking the packet and just, reviewing some of these other approaches and seeing if we could, adopt something like plantings, or, modifying the physical environment to discourage panhandlers from congregating in that area. We don't need laws to do that.
Right. And could I ask? does
I want
anybody
to,
else-
I have a long list, but that's okay. It's your
Okay.
order. Keep going.
Well, I know, but you haven't had an opportunity yet.
It's all right. Keep
Well,
going.
this is a technical question, Kara, because somebody that made a comment thinks that soliciting money from motor vehicles is illegal. And I don't know if it is or isn't, but if you could. Hmm? from
From an occupant of a
vehicles.
vehicle.
Right.
Well,
And
probably
so-
because it creates some sort of traffic hazard would be
Well,
the
no,
argument.
but I'm just interested to know if there is anything anywhere that does prohibit it, because I can't find it, but.
I know, I'll look back through, there were a few, but there were a few statutes that were quite old that actually, I mean, they might still be on the books, but have been struck down. I know we had looked at some of those back then. I don't know. I mean, I would think if that was the case, the police would be able to enforce that, and so I would have to imagine.
Right, but I just thought maybe if something got buried and for some reason it hasn't been on the radar, if we're looking, no harm in seeing. So it's just a technical request, so, thanks, Kara.
Counselor Alexander.
Hi, Kara.
You thought I was bad, wait.
Let me start by thanking Councilor Bacon for filing this order, because I've probably gotten 20 complaints about this. I think I had a discussion with you, Kara, probably 3 years ago about it, and it was, well, it's a free speech issue, and I just kind of let it drop, and thank you for not letting it drop, because it's out of control. The city is they're everywhere. I mean, it's like an invasion of the money snatchers. It needs to be brought under control somehow, and I think the public safety angle that we talked about a little bit, that, well, if the median's more than 2 feet wide, you can't prohibit people from standing on it or whatever. I think that's a straw man. I think we're trying to go the public safety route as a way to clamp down on panhandling. The problem isn't public safety. The problem is perceived intimidation, quality of life, perceived friendliness to visitors coming into the city, all those sorts of things. It's the image the city creates. And we need to get this under control. So I will not vote for anything that says do nothing. We need to find a path forward. Waiting for the Supreme Court to issue some inscrutable opinion some year down the road when they get around to it does not seem like a viable. Like, great, we can revisit it in a year if the Supreme Court shoots something down. If the Supreme Court says Worcester's fine, that's great. We can all of a sudden adopt the Worcester ordinance. But until then, we need to do something here. So with that said, a couple of thoughts. South Hadley, you're going to look into, Kara? You're going to dig
Yes.
further into that? Northampton, you're aware of. I know one of the things Northampton did, now, Northampton's a different downtown, and it's a very pedestrian-oriented downtown. They, I believe, prohibited panhandling within 5 feet, 8 feet of a store entrance, which means, of course, forget about panhandling on Main Street in Northampton. But nevertheless, it was because people didn't like being accosted as they were walking in and out of businesses, and the business owners were saying, this is negatively impacting our ability to generate revenue, keep our storefront full, and pay taxes to this city. So, it goes right back to City Hall's budget, which is our ability to provide services for the people who do pay taxes in the city. So I would say, take a deep look at Northampton. I want to, I think, disagree with something you said, Kara, that if somebody holds up a sign that says, I'm raising money for, I'm asking for donations because I want food, when in fact they're spending it on cigarettes and lottery, I don't care what they're spending it on, not food, that's free speech. That's not free speech, that's intent to defraud. By law, that's intent to defraud. You cannot say, I want money for this purpose, and then use it for this other purpose. Any more than the guy who we just got a notice, we all got it, from the police department, about the guy who's knocking on doors and saying, hi, I'm collecting money for the veterans, put it in my pocket fund.
Right, is that freedom of
No, that's a scam, it's intent to defraud, it's illegal, you go to jail for that. So on that same basis, you can't hold up a sign that says, I want money for food, unless you want money for food. Granted, it's a little harder to prove, and granted, money is fungible. I put it in my pocket and I take out a different dollar and buy cigarettes, whatever. But I just want to raise that point. You can't lie. No,
I can look.
you can't lie.
I'll look into that further. But from what these cases have said, the court is very clear that your ordinance has to be, and maybe that is.
No, you would need to go after somebody for intent to defraud. But if they're holding up a sign saying, I'm doing X, Girl Scouts can't come to your door and say, I want money for the Girl Scouts, and then they spend it on something else.
The signage and the actually saying it might be two different things. I'm happy to look into that further.
I think the Supreme Court's been pretty clear that signage is a form of speech. So I would say they're They're
These
interchangeable.
recent cases are they're a whole new ballgame on what you think is and is not content neutral.
And I would worry a little bit if this Supreme Court were presented with, this is an organized activity that is in essence a corporate activity, because they'll give
Well, but
any free speech rights to corporations, never mind what people can do.
But to that point, and I can't stress this enough, you have to prove that. If that's what is going to distinguish what we're doing from what everybody else is doing, we
Agreed.
have to prove
Agreed.
that.
I
Because
just-
otherwise, it's no different than the
Yep.
other ordinances that have been struck down with a person sitting on the side of the road holding a sign that
Yep.
can honestly
Yep.
say whatever
So
they
now
want
we
it to
have on the
say.
books today, I remember it because I filed an order to move the permitting process to somebody else. We have I forget where it is right now, might be at the police department, might be here, but I filed an order to move it somewhere else. We have an order on the books for, I think it's hawking or peddling and peddlers and hawkers license, hawkers and solicitors license, barristers and solicitors, I forget. Anyway, something that says, if you're going up to somebody and saying, if you give me money, I'll give you this thing, you have to register with the city.
But you don't have a thing.
Exactly. So
So I want to.
I think that's a small reach. I want you to give me money and I'm giving you nothing in return. We should be able to also require registration for it. I think that's an immediate, it's a direct route. And look, I'm sorry, I'm maybe a little bit passionate about this. To me, this activity, except for the guy who sits very quietly, but the ones who walk down the thing, knocking on car fenders and all this kind of thing, this is harassment, all right? And I say let's just turn it on its head. So make them register, bust their chops if they're not registered. If they're on private property, show me on your person permission from the private property owner. Take care of the large parking lots where there is no immediate owner to say, yeah, I'm not worried about somebody doing it in their driveway. I'm worried about somebody doing it at Kmart, right? Or wherever your senior was, who was accosted on private property. I'm sure the property owner didn't give permission for that. We can require that they have written permission, okay? And if they don't, get out of here. Sorry, you're not allowed to do that, right? You're trespassing. So I think those are two angles to go after immediately. And I think we could have something on the books in 60 days on those two issues. I don't think that's difficult at all. Kara, the current court case, the Worcester one, I guess I'm focusing on, is now, you said, in front of the Supreme Court, or it's been appealed to the Supreme Court?
So went through, they had a trial in the district court, went to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Both the district court and the Circuit Court of Appeals essentially upheld the ordinance, and then it went up to the United States Supreme Court, who remanded it back to the lower courts to take another look at in light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling in the Reed versus Gilbert case.
That was the signage?
That's the
case?
signage case. And so that, they sent it back to the Court of Appeals, they sent it back to the district court.
So it's been upheld twice, but it's been kicked all the way back down to the lowest court that it started in?
Yeah, by the Supreme Court.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
and the Lowell case, the Lowell case has come after that has happened, so it might be interesting to see. But this is all in the same court, have to keep in mind. But both the Lowell case and the Portland case were after the Worcester one got sent back down. So, the Portland one, I don't think that the city of Portland has appealed that any further.
Which Portland is this?
Portland, Maine. So it's still within the First Circuit. That decision actually was just September 11th, 2015. So there could be further proceedings in that case. And that was the one about the traffic medians.
I'm going to tell a 3-second story here. I was in San Francisco driving, and I blew a red. It happens. It was a stop sign, actually, but I rolled through it because I didn't see it. I was busy gawking at something, and a cop pulled me over. And his response was, you need to be really careful about that because the panhandlers will run out in front of your car and get hit on purpose so that they can sue you and own your life. Okay, so this is a real issue, and I just wanted to put that on the record that I've had that experience. Regarding, sorry,
Just
go
to
ahead.
that point, there's other circuits that are doing the same thing as this one in light of the court's decision in Reed. So, ultimately, this is all going to come back to a head, and it's all going to come back to a head in the Supreme Court. So, I mean, I only looked, I found one case in Illinois where it was the same thing. They sent it back for further proceedings in light of the Reed decision.
And if somebody figures out how to incorporate all the panhandlers nationwide into one giant corporation, the Supreme Court will grant them the right to
We could Uber
stand
them.
on the dotted line on the interstates with their sign.
Yeah, but you won't be able to regulate their signs, because that was the whole thing of Reed, which is
Right.
a whole nother.
On the interstate, and to Councilor Vacon's comment about somebody on the ramp, that's already illegal. Hitchhiking is prohibited on the interstate. Pedestrians are prohibited on the interstate. The state has found that they can regulate where pedestrians can stand relative to a road. You're also not allowed to ride a horse on the interstate. You're not allowed to ride a bicycle on the interstate. There are certain things you can't do on a road, okay? And it's not, you can't be on the shoulder of the road either. You can't stand on the grass and hitchhike. There are activities that are prohibited because it's a public way. So on that basis, I think that could be looked further at. And the ACLU isn't suing because I'm not allowed to hitchhike on the interstate highway. I can go hitchhike on a side road if I want to. What else did I want to say? I think I'm good. I think registration, citywide, permission for activity on private property so that the police know you're not trespassing, and the fact that we already have permit requirements on the books for, I mean, I'm sure the Girl Scouts, when they're out selling cookies, are supposed to have a permit. I'm sure they don't, but that's because they're the Girl Scouts and everybody loves them and they have those mint things. But they should have a permit. We have a hawker's license. We have a peddler's license. I think we have a tinker's license on the book still. I see no problem whatsoever with this slight extension of the covered activities under that type of license. And frankly, if you're not willing to go through that minor level of effort, and granted, these people are presumably broke, that's why they're panhandling, we can make the fee as zero as far as I'm concerned, make it unonerous. But you need to at least make the effort to identify yourself to the police so that they know why you're here and who you are. I don't think that's unreasonable at all. There was something in here which I thought was interesting, but it addressed as a condition of probation, saying you can't panhandle in certain locations if you've already been arrested for panhandling in some other location. But I think it's something we could look at. What are the qualifications for getting that permit? I believe I'm sorry, what do you call it? The people who wander around with their little cart full of stuff, who we currently have a permit thing, hawker's license, whatever it is. Peddlers, the peddler's license, I'm sorry, is issued, I believe, don't hold me to this, by the police department. That's where you have to go to get it, not the city council, amazingly enough. I'm sure the police department have somewhere, I don't believe it's in the ordinance, a list of the criteria that they look at. You can't be a convicted felon. You can't have a fraud conviction, and then go out and be a peddler in the city. I think there's nothing wrong with extending similar criteria to a panhandler's license. This is aggressive behavior. You're asking people to give you money on a certain premise. We are reasonably able to say, okay, we want to know something about you then before we allow this activity. So I think there's a path forward here. Thank you.
Councilor Bacon.
And to your point, Counselor Alexander, I was told this story secondhand, granted, but a woman had been robbed at her house, and the robber left the backpack at her house, and in the backpack was a panhandler sign.
Good.
And so but I think that's to your point. Who are these people? And if unfortunately many of them are involved in drug dependence, they're unfortunately often involved in robberies. And there's a definite need to know from the public point of view, and a registration process allows them to have the card on them if they're there under the rules. And if they don't, then it allows the police the opportunity to say, move along. You don't have a permit, and they can tell them where to go get it. I think that sounds very fair, and I would be willing to amend my order, although the language in my order that was intended to be the order was that we review it to revise the language.
Yeah, that's
You
what I
know
got
I mean?
out of it. I don't think
All
it
the rest
had a
of the
specific
language
prescription.
Wasn't necessarily, this should be the language. It was just examples. So, I would be willing to amend my order to say that we institute the,
Honestly, I
think
think
you
the
need to
order's
amend
fine.
the
We'll come
order.
up with a proposed solution in ordinance as the committee works. If I could just add one thing to carry to your homework
And then
list, I'm
Counselor
sorry.
Shatnoff is in queue.
I'm sorry, this is, 2 seconds. If you find that it would be a reasonable approach to go down the registration road, can you do some research on what kind of criteria are not likely to be shot down instantaneously?
Yes, this
Thank
is
you.
just going to be a.
Thank you. And I'm willing to,
I mean, there- 'cause
let's
this
put
is-
something on the books. If somebody wants
Yeah.
to sue, okay, let's get something on the books.
Well, and that's, I mean, again, I can't say enough, I think the police need to be involved and there needs to be, further
They'll be involved.
further documentation and facts developed. I mean, I'm happy to look into legally whether or not we can do that to start, but, again, you need to have a clear record of what the problem is and how you can create the most narrowly tailored solution to that problem. So,
Before the next time we meet, I think having some sort of references to the registration component would be useful, and then having the chief being able to comment on that. I mean, even as someone who canvassed and went door to door for many years, I know that in most communities you could just go door to door. It's political free speech. It's a slightly different issue because we're going door to door. We're talking about politics.
yeah, and that might cross over into this is extensive Supreme Court research, so that might cross over into a whole nother area because, again, the ordinance has to be content neutral. So it's going to be anybody soliciting any kind of money, and so it might cross into areas of political free speech and commercial and.
But there were definitely communities that made us register. They couldn't ever say, no, you can't come in, but there were some communities that made us register, and I think they would do some sort of background check to make sure, again.
Yeah, because you did this for Perg or somebody at one point, didn't
Clean
you?
Water Action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you remember what any of those are, and can let
Communities?
me know, that would be helpful. Yeah.
So like one of the most restrictive was West Hartford in Connecticut.
Okay.
Who required us to get permits and come down to this police station for the time that we were there to get photo IDs as we were going door to door. That was like the most restrictive. I think Granby actually made us register in advance, but there are very few communities that actually made us, register and fill out these permits. But I remember West Hartford was one of the most restrictive, and that required us going down early one day to get our photos and photo ID taken.
was that Granby, Connecticut or Granby, Mass?
No, Granby, Mass. And I mean, it was.
Sounds tough.
Everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
I can't think of any others off the top of my
Okay.
head, but I
No,
could look into it.
Yeah, if you remember. Okay.
Counselor Shatnoff.
Just 2 things. First, on the political thing, since we're just talking about that, if that's one more thing a politician has to do is register to do a standout, then we have to register to do a standout. We'll do it. Like, I can't see that being an issue. You got to do what you got to do to get elected. But going back to the registration part, what I would like, I'm not going to put a number on it, but panhandlers, that is their only form of income. They are homeless. Those signs are telling the truth. But then other ones, like I saw one day, who pulls up in his big white SUV with his wife, gives her a kiss goodbye, gets out the sign and goes to the corner of Hampden Street. And I'm at the light and I look at him, I go, seriously? Seriously? You have got to be kidding me. And he's just like,
Gas is
so
expensive for those
maybe
SUVs.
It'll shame some of these people. They actually go to the police station and register, and they won't be scamming people. That's what I would like to see.
Motion to table.
A motion is,
I feel like we've beaten the horse enough for one night.
Next meeting, we should definitely bring in someone from the police department.
Yeah, absolutely.
So motion has been made and seconded to table this item. All in favor?
Aye.
So moved.
Kara, thank you. Motion to adjourn?
Motion has been made and seconded to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
And thank you, Kara. I mean, I wasn't trying to be thick, it's just frustrating, you know?
Well, it's just, I mean, when you read, and I'm happy to send the cases, I mean, these cities spent years documenting the problem and surveying the problem before they adopted.
Doing nothing is not an option.
It just isn't. What are we gonna sit?
Well, right, and that's part of it, but I mean, they didn't adopt these just, you know, there was mayors and city managers and city councils studying the problem so that they had this to back it up, so.
Thank you, Karen. Short and sweet. Michael, talk soon.
We're gonna be away that weekend. My
Okay.
cousin's getting married down in Rhode Island. I mentioned it to Damien.